What was your time at school like? Do you remember? What was the measure of a good time at school? Was it really good marks? Was it pleasing your teachers and your parents? Or did you ever get asked, like, how you going? Like, what's your well-being? What's the well-being of all the students? And the school you went to put it frankly, were you a poor kid going to school with all the other poor kids? Or maybe you were a rich kid going to school with all the other rich kids? Was there diversity when it comes to that socioeconomic background? Well, these are just some of the things that have been looked at by this new expert panel report that's just come out. There is set to be a new national agreement around funding of education nationally, and there's a heap of recommendations that seek to change the way we not only measure, but also improve the school experience. So how are we going to do it? Well, let's talk to someone who puts a lot of thought into these things. Dr. David Roy, School of Education with the University of Newcastle. Doctor, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Paul. Good to be here.
It's just a heap of recommendations here that we can sort of look at. I wonder if I might throw it to you and ask what caught your eye that is really interesting about the way we approach these things.
Well, I think the largest issue is the fact they're finally publicly across the board recognizing that what many of us have known for a long time and has been commented on, we have a really unequal education system, probably one of the most inequitable in the world, and we've just allowed it to grow and fester into inequity, and now we've got to fix it. And they're at least putting together this panel with recommendations, trying to create a roadmap, and that's always a positive thing.
So what does that inequity look like?
Well, the inequity is that we have 27 systems in Australia. Basically, we've got 3 per state territory of the Catholic, the independent, and the public systems. And they get funded in different ways, and that creates different workloads for staff, different ways for them to progress in their careers. It creates schools where there are clusters of types of students, that therefore there's a lack of diversity, which means they kind of grow up with a certain type of people, and you tend to employ the same people you know. And so it creates further divisions down into society. And many successful Western nations, shall we say, don't have that kind of those barriers that we are self-creating for ourselves. So we need to come for a solution because we're losing staff. We've got students who aren't being able to achieve what they want to. And so we have a kind of a crisis in multiple fronts. And we have governments being led from federal trying to say, okay, we now need to address this just for our kids, that our kids can get the best opportunities.
So that phenomena and that result in the way that our education system has played out over many decades, is that an incredibly difficult thing to unpick?
It's going to be a long process. And one of the things they do recognise in the Approving Outcomes for All report, which is the title of the report that came out, if anyone wants to look it up on the net, is the fact that it's got to be a 10-year plan. We seem to have had, at state levels at least, changes for staff, changes for curriculum, changes for students happening every 6 months to a year, continual change. And if we can have a wee bit of stability and say, here's our 10-year outlook and goal, then we might actually be able to try to implement some of the ideas, measure how they're doing, and adapt as we see what works and what isn't working as we thought it might do. Because that's the nature of change, is not everything works and some things work better than you expected.
There's a lot that are sort of, I suppose, more general in nature. I mean, certainly talking about things like socioeconomic background and diversity within schools, talking about, the well-being of a student population as opposed to just looking at curriculum. Although I do want to focus on some specific recommendations here, including a year 1 phonics check and an equivalent numeracy screening check. So what do they do? I'm sort of curious about what those functions are.
It's basically like a kind of a mini NAT plan for phonics to see what is the level of language and language usage for kids within phonics and what would be the level of numeracy. And then we get a baseline to say, this is where different kids are at. And can we then measure and see that there has been improvement throughout the years, or if we need to do targeted intervention. Now, that's a good thing. Because if we don't know where we are at the start, if we just presume that all the kids are the same, then we might be missing some kids or not stretching some others. What worries many of us is if we use that as a way of ranking schools, because all that does when you start to rank schools against one another is it pushes people into moving and creating sinks or areas of disadvantage or areas of too much advantage, as it were, and it maintains the kind of inequitableness. So long as it's used in a way that is internal and is not used to kind of say you're a good school, you're a bad school, but actually to say these are the kids we've got and this is where we need to target support in a way like we might do in medicine and triage the issue.
Can I mention the private school funding elephant in the room? In fact, just got a text message.
I've worked in both public, Catholic and private, so I've been in all those systems.
Well, I'm curious about this. We've got a text message here saying, quite simply, stop giving public funds to wealthy private schools. It is a debate in Australia that has been raging for decades. What's your view of how we actually look at these things?
That's a lovely ideological position to have, and I understand that. The problem is the genie is out the bottle. If you just cut funding to independent and Catholic schools, then you're really saying to 42% of the population, your school's losing money, your kid will suffer. That is a political suicide for anyone who wants to do it. So I don't see that as being a reality. I and many others have always argued, instead of removing funding, maintain their funding as you've got, because it's kind of a done deal. It's like trying to uninvent the nuclear bomb. And instead, raise all public schools to the same level as the independent schools. Then you're probably going to have smart parents going, so I can get the same resources for my kids from the same size of classrooms with the same extracurricular events with the same resources and not have to pay a penny for it. What would you choose? Being a canny Scot, I like to save my money. I would go to the public sector if they were all equal, unless there was a very particular, maybe religious or philosophical reason for going to another type of school. So let's not take away from others. Let's give more.
But I mean, look, to sort of talk about the extremes, if we're like, is it really possible to raise a public school up to the level of private school in terms of, say, infrastructure? You know, the 3 Olympic swimming pools, the world-class rowing program, you know, the pristine rugby field, all of that kind of stuff. Can you actually match public for private?
You can start to match up to it, actually. I see it happen. I'm originally, as I've mentioned, from Scotland, and back around the 1990s, they realised all the public schools there were in real disrepair in the area of Glasgow, and they created private partnerships with companies, and every single school got refurbished or rebuilt with brand new facilities. And I was working in some of the nicest facilities I'd come across, having also worked in an independent school within Scotland as well. So it is potential, but it takes effort, it takes commitment, and it takes a change of spending, not just from education, but actually at Treasury level, because that we're talking about a major infrastructure for the whole of Australia. Whether or not there is the political will to actually carry that through and be supported by partisan, that's a whole different issue. I'm biased. I work in education, and I think education is one of the most important, along with social housing and with health, for our nation if we're going to really thrive.
Yeah, it's almost hard to argue against that that concept, I think, Doctor. I'm curious, so this expert panel recommendations, they're on the website, and people can look for it now, Improving Outcomes for All. They've been published on the education website. So it's there for all to see. We'll see whether the proof, is in the pudding in terms of what the Education Minister in that national agreement actually is. Is there something in particular? Obviously, there's a big suite of recommendations there. Yeah.
And he will actually be present at the University of Newcastle tomorrow for the graduation of education students who are going into the teaching workforce, which is quite exciting, with the new developments of our graduate diploma 1 year. So there are changes happening, and there is hope for the future.
Well, thank you for the tip. The Education Minister is going to be here. We'll see if he wants to have a chat. But what do you think is, like, if I get him on the radio tomorrow and sort of put it to him, what's the one thing that you would say, if you can ever implement one thing out of this, what would you want to see?
I think it would be to take our most disadvantaged and give them an education they deserve. The poorest, those who are disabled, those who are marginalised, make sure they're fully included and they're getting their resources at least at the measure that is supposed to be given to them at 100%.
Doctor, thank you so much for the chat this afternoon.
Anytime, Paul.
Dr. David Roy, School of Education with the University of Newcastle.